turn in your Bible to the book of Genesis chapter 24. This chapter gives us a beautiful account of how Rebekah became Isaac's wife. And it goes into quite a bit of detail. In fact, it's the longest chapter in the book of Genesis. It has 67 verses. Now, because there is so much material in this chapter, we're not going to be able to cover the entire chapter tonight. Hopefully, you weren't expecting that. In fact, what we're going to do is only cover the first 9 verses. You see, whenever I come to a passage of Scripture that has a lot of information in it that I want to share, I have to think about how I'm going to divide it up. Because you don't want to stop in the middle of a thought, and then next week we have to pick it up again. Because then I have to do a lot of review to catch up. So what I do when there's a lot of information is I think about how I'm going to split this up. So tonight we're only going to cover the first 9 verses, and hopefully next week we'll move a lot faster. We might be able to finish chapter 24, but I really doubt it, and I'm not making any promises. So turn to Genesis chapter 24, verse number 1. And Abraham was old and well stricken in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Now, how old was Abraham at this point in his life? Does anyone know? Well, he was about 140 years old. And let me explain how we know that. Genesis chapter 25, verse number 20 tells us that Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. And Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So that would make Abraham 140 years old when Isaac and Rebekah got married. So Abraham was about 140 at this point in his life. Now, why don't we know that he was exactly 140? Because if you remember, the servant's going to have to travel back to where Abraham came from, which is a distance of 500 miles one way, and then he's going to have to come back, and so there's some months in there. So he was either 139 or 140, and it's just better to say he was about 140 years old. So Abraham was old and well stricken in age. Now, you need to understand what that phrase means, well-stricken in age. It doesn't just say he was old. He was well-stricken in age. In other words, age was starting to catch up with him. Now, if you're past 50, you understand what I'm talking about. Age begins to catch up with you. I started losing my hair in the later 20s. By the mid-30s, it was gone. It seems like I'm putting on more and more weight. I try and lose it, but it's just easier to come back on. Gravity's beginning to work. All of a sudden, you're feeling aches and pains that you've never felt before. In fact, I got tickled. My wife has a bone spur on her heel, and she's not able to jog. And, my wife has never had any health problems. Well, I take that back. Pituitary gland tumor, but God miraculously healed her of that. But she's never had any aches and pains. And, from my early 20s, because of knee operations and torn rotator cuffs and broken bones and disjoint things taken out of socket, it's like I have these aches and pains. And so finally it was like, yes, she has an aches and pains. See how it feels. But anyways, Abraham was well stricken in age. And that phrase means that he had aches and pains and he was feeling his age. And now that Sarah was dead, he realized that it was very possible for him to pass away very soon. And he hadn't fulfilled his duty as a father and obtained a bride for Isaac. Now, the reason that he'd waited so long was because he didn't want Isaac marrying a Canaanite woman. But he also felt like he wasn't supposed to leave Canaan, because every time that he'd stepped out of God's will in the past, he'd ended up in trouble. So up to this point, he hadn't even tried to obtain a wife for Isaac. He was just waiting on God to do something miraculous or for God to lead him. But now that Sarah had died and he was old and well stricken in age, he realized that he needed to do something. So he chose a servant to travel to Mesopotamia to acquire a wife for Isaac. Look at verses 2, 3, and 4. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house, that ruled over all that he had, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. And I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but thou shalt go into my country, into my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac. So the servant that Abraham chose for this special mission was the oldest servant in the house. And it also tells us he was the overseer of Abraham's property. Now, most scholars believe that the servant that they're talking about was Eliezer. If you remember, before Abraham had any children, he was complaining to God. And what did he tell God? He said, I don't have anyone to be an heir. Eliezer from Damascus, a servant in my house, is my heir. Turn back to Genesis chapter 15, verses 2 and 3. But Abram replied, his name has not been changed at this point. He has no children. God has not changed his name and put that spirit from Abram to Abraham, right? So this is Abram. But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. Now, Abraham is about 75 years old at this time, and he's 140. You can do the math. 65 years has passed. So when we read in Genesis chapter 24 that is the oldest servant in his household, we begin to think, now who would that be? So I want you to think about it. Before Abraham had any children, one of his servants would have been heir to his property had he died. And we're told here in Genesis chapter 15 that that servant was Eliezer. Now, as the heir, he would have been specifically trained to oversee Abraham's property since it would be his one day, or I should say his responsibility. But after Ishmael and Isaac were born, Eliezer was no longer heir, but he was trained to be the overseer of Abraham's property. So most scholars believe, even though it doesn't say that, the servant chosen to acquire a wife for Isaac was Eliezer. So Abraham called Eliezer into his tent, his oldest, most trusted servant, the overseer of his property, and he made him take an oath. Look back at verses 2, 3, and 4 again. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house, that ruled over all that he had, Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son, the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but thou shalt go into my country, into my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac. Okay, how many of you want to know why Abraham made his servant put his hand under his thigh when he took the oath? How many of you want to know that? Now, let me ask you this. Are you sure you want to know? Because the explanation of this particular custom might seem a little crass in today's society. So do you want to know or not? You want to know? Let's go for it. Now, I've put out the disclaimer. If you're offended by what I show you and tell you tonight, it's your own fault. All right? So the first thing you have to understand, if you want to understand this custom, is you need to understand what the word thigh actually means. Because he didn't place his hand underneath Abraham's thigh. He placed his hand under another part of Abraham's body. You see, the word thigh is translated from the Hebrew word yarek, and it actually refers to the loins. Yeah. In fact, let me show you how this word is used in other passages of Scripture throughout the Old Testament. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Genesis chapter 46, verse number 26. It says, All the sows that came with Jacob into Egypt, which came out of his loins. Besides Jacob's sons' wives, all the sows were 66. Now, the word loins is translated from the very same Hebrew word, yarek. Now look at Exodus chapter 1, verse number 5. And all the sows that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 sows, for Joseph was in Egypt already. Now, that word loins is translated from the very same Hebrew word, yarek. So, the word thigh is being used figuratively in Genesis chapter 24 to refer to Abraham's loins. In other words, his genitals. So what Abraham was doing was telling his servant to place his hand between his thighs on the outside of his clothes, nothing kinky here, but his hand was to be placed under Abraham's genitals while Abraham was sitting down. Now, I told you it'd be a little crass, but you need to understand what I'm talking about. we'll go a little bit more in depth in this, but how many of you women are married to a man that when he watches football and he's not paying attention, he's sitting on the couch and he does this? Okay, that's what this is talking about. He told his servant to place his hand under his thigh. The word thigh is the Hebrew word yarek. It actually means genitals. He wasn't supposed to put it underneath the clothing. It actually went on the outside of the clothing, and you kept your hand straight, and you would slide it right underneath. All right, you needed to understand that because we're going to get a little bit deeper in just a second. So, what Abraham was telling his servant was to place his hand between his thighs. Now, this type of oath was very common in Abraham's day. This wasn't something special. This wasn't something new. No one had ever done this before. Abraham was starting this new custom. It was very normal in that time period. In fact, in pagan circles, the person who was making someone take an oath would require that they place their hand under his genitals on the outside of his clothes, and this is how they did it. The person requiring the oath would sit down, while the one making the oath would kneel down. So the person who was making someone else take the oath would sit down. The one who was actually making the oath would kneel down. They would be face to face. He would take his hand, place it between his thighs, and slide it underneath his genitals, being flat. This symbolized that his descendants, his seed, would make sure that the person who was making the oath kept it. And if he didn't keep the oath, the man's descendants would avenge him. They would take the person's life or punish him in some way for failing to perform his duty. So this was a very common custom, especially among the pagans. Now, Abraham and his descendants, and who are his descendants? The Hebrews, the Jews. So Abraham and his descendants adopted this custom, but they twisted it a little bit so it had a slightly different meaning. For the Jews, the thigh, and again, that's being used as a euphemism, we're talking about the genitals, indicated the procreative power and heritage of the patriarch's position as the source of the family. In other words, the genitals symbolized his procreative power, in other words, that he had seed, and his position as the life giver to his descendants. It was through his seed the family had been created. So this type of oath was kind of like swearing on your mother's grave. Everyone knows what it means to swear on your mother's grave, right? You're swearing on something you hold very dear, your mother's grave. So as I said, this type of oath was kind of like swearing on your mother's grave, except you're swearing on the heritage of the patriarch's position as the source of the family. And you're doing it in the sight of God, who will judge whether you faithfully fulfilled your oath or not. Now, look back at verse number 3, because when he tells him what to do, he tells his servant to place your hand underneath my thigh, and the word thigh is a euphemism. And then this is what it says in the first part of verse 3. And I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, and the God of the earth. And then he tells him what he's going to make him swear, that thou shalt not take a wife unto the son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. Now, this is the same type of oath that Joseph made to Jacob when he promised that Jacob's body would not be buried in Egypt. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Genesis, chapter 47, verses 29 through 31. And the time drew nigh that Israel must die. Now, who is Israel? Does everyone know? Jacob. God changed Jacob's name just like he changed Abraham's name. Abraham's original name was Abram. He changed it to Abraham. He changed Jacob's name to Israel. Now, why didn't he change Isaac's name? Do you remember? Because God named Isaac. God did not name Abram, and he didn't name Jacob. They were named by their parents. So God changed their name. So when we talk about Israel, we're talking about Jacob. So it says, let's go back and read that. I'm going to start in the beginning. And the time drew near that Jacob must die, and he called his son Joseph. And he said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt, but I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. And he said, swear unto me. And he swore unto him. And Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. In other words, what he was saying is, wait a minute, my father and my grandfather were promised the land of Canaan. We came down here because of the famine, but I want to be buried in the land that God promised my father and my grandfather and for my children. Swear unto me that you won't allow my body to be buried here, but when I die, you'll take my body to Israel. And it wasn't good enough for him just to swear. He said, place your hand under my thigh. He's going back to this. So Joseph was swearing on the heritage of his father's position as one of the patriarchs of God's chosen people. He was swearing by the person who fathered him and his brothers and sisters. And God was going to be watching to see if he kept his promise. And if not, God would judge him. Now, in Genesis chapter 24, we're going to take a step back, go back to our original chapter. In Genesis chapter 24, when Abraham made his servant take an oath, and he made him place his hand under his thigh, it signified two things. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. Because by the time you get to Joseph, they had kind of twisted it and made it their own way. But back in Abraham's time, it signified two things. All right? Number one, it signified that he was swearing on the heritage of Abraham's position as the patriarch of God's chosen people. You're swearing on God's chosen man, the one that God called out of the heathens and said, you are the man that I'm going to raise a nation up from his descendants, and my chosen one will come through him. So it signified that he was swearing on the heritage of Abraham's position as the patriarch of God's chosen people, and he was doing it in the sight of God, who would judge whether he fulfilled this oath or not. And we looked at verse number 3, and we saw that. But it also signified, this is the second thing, that Isaac had the right to avenge Abraham if the servant didn't perform his duty that he had solemnly sworn to do. Now, you need to understand something, which I probably should have added back then, but this is the perfect place. You did not make someone swear this way unless you thought you were going to die. When you thought you were going to die, you made them swear this way because what you were doing, remember, was you were saying that if you don't fulfill what you've sworn, my descendants will avenge me. My children, my grandchildren, they have the right to avenge me if you don't keep it. So you were actually saying when you had a person do this that, I don't think I'm going to live very long. I want you to do this. I'm not going to be around to make sure that you do it, so my children will. Is everyone following me? So basically, the second thing this signified was Abraham was old and he was well stricken in age. He needed to find a bride for Isaac. Sarah was dead. He was starting to feel the aches and pains, and he was thinking, you know what? I might not live to see him married. So he brings this servant in and he says, you swear to me that if I'm gone, you're going to fulfill what you promised. And if you don't do it, Isaac will avenge me. My grandchildren will avenge me. So now you understand the custom of taking an oath with your hand under the thigh of another person. So as you're reading through the Old Testament, you come upon this, go back to Genesis chapter 24, and then you understand the purpose of it. Now, what did the servant swear to do? Well, look back at verses 2, 3, and 4, because this is what Abraham wanted him to swear to. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house that ruled over all that he had, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. He's like Jacob. He thinks he's going to die. He doesn't think he's going to see the promise fulfilled. I want you to understand that my seed will avenge me if you don't fulfill this. And I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth. And why is he doing this? Because if Isaac doesn't do it, God will. That thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but thou shalt go into my country, into my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac. So Abraham made his servant swear to do three things. Number one, to never allow Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman. Under any circumstances, I don't care what it is, do not marry a Canaanite woman. Now, if you understand the pagan practices and you understand that they actually participated in what was known as imitation magic. How many of you know what imitation magic is? Anyone? How many of you don't know what imitation magic is? Okay, let me just explain something. The Canaanites did not believe in one God. They believed in they believed in a multitude of gods. There was a God for this and a God for that. But they believed that the way that the earth became fertile, the way that you had great crops, is that the gods had sex. And when the gods had sex, then you would have a bountiful harvest. So the way that you would get the gods to have sex is you would turn them on like pornography. So what they would do is they would actually have sexual orgies. They would have temple prostitutes. You would come in and you would have sexual acts as a form of worship, but the whole purpose of it was to turn the gods on so they would have sex. They would imitate the people, have sex, and you'd have a bountiful crop. And that's one of the reasons that God says, and if you don't understand this, as you're reading through the Old Testament, you think, boy, he just really wanted them to separate and have nothing to do with the Canaanites. Well, the reason he didn't want them to have anything to do with the Canaanites is because of how perverted they were. There was homosexuality. It was not just the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Bestiality. All types of different sexual sins, and they were corrupted by this. And so God comes along and he says, I don't ever under any circumstances want you to marry a Canaanite woman. I don't want my son to be anywhere around them. So that was the first thing. Number two, he wanted him to swear to find a wife for Isaac from the land that he came from and also from his relatives if it were possible. Because they had been, even though they were still into idolatry, they still understood what Abraham had been called to. They might not have agreed with him, they might not have believed like that, but he had witnessed to them before he left. He had to explain why God was calling him out and what God was calling him to do. And just as those caravans came through, and we were seeing this in the book of Genesis chapter 22, the last part, when it was talking about the genealogy of Nahor, and it gets all the way down and talks about Rebekah. He had heard about his family, but just as he'd heard about his family who was in the land that he came from, they had heard about him and how God had blessed him. And in his old age and in Sarah's old age, God did a miracle, and they had a child. So, that was the second thing he wanted. And the third thing that he wanted him to swear to was to never take Isaac back to the land Abraham came from. Look at verses 5 and 6. The servant asked, but what if I can't find a young woman who's willing to travel so far from home? Should I then take Isaac there to live among your relatives in the land you came from? No, Abraham responded. Be careful never to take my son there. Now, why do you think that is? I'm going to give you one reason for it. There's many reasons, but I'm going to give you one. Many times we don't understand why God would take the land from the Canaanites and give it to the Jews. Even today we say, well, you know, God promised the land to the Jews, but it's not right to take that land from one and give it to another. You need to understand something. One of the reasons that he sent Joseph down into Egypt, that's part of his plan, and then Jacob's sons went there along with Jacob, and then they grew very powerful there, but then they became servants when a Pharaoh rose who knew not Joseph. And then God had to bring them out. The reason it took so long to be able to do that is because the sin of the Canaanites was not yet full. They had become so sinful that God's judgment was, I'm going to root them out of the land's going to vomit them out, and I'm going to give this land to them. And he didn't want Isaac to go back because this was the land. He foresaw the future, knew what type of sin they were going to be involved in. He was going to give them chance after chance, but he still knew what was going to take place, and so he was going to give this land to them. So he said, no. Now, the servant didn't see it from Abraham's eyes. He didn't have the relationship. Eliezer did not have the relationship with God that Abraham had. So the servant was going to have to go 500 miles one way to get to where Abraham came from. And the servant wanted to know, well, what do I do if I get there and I find a woman, but the woman is not willing to be this far away from home? Should I take Isaac back to the land that you came from? And Abraham said, never, under any circumstances, are you to ever take Isaac to the land that I came from. And then Abraham explained why. Look at the first part of verse 7. For the Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and my native land, solemnly promised to give this land to my descendants. Canaan was where Isaac was supposed to be, and it was where all of his descendants were supposed to be. So never under any circumstances take Isaac back to where Abraham came from. And that's why Jacob, when he was in the land of Egypt, he said, I'm here. I don't understand why we haven't been brought back. But son, stick your hand underneath my thigh, and you promise me that when I die, you don't bury me here. You take me back to the land that God promised to give our descendants. Now, Abraham had every confidence in the world that a servant would be able to find a wife for Isaac from his homeland. In fact, he believed that God was going to direct the servant's steps to find the right woman. Look at, if you would, the last part of verse number 7. He will send his angel ahead of you, and he will see to it that you find a wife there for my son. I don't know whether Abraham had another vision or if it was just faith, that he knew that God had made this promise, so this is the way it was going to work out. But we do know one thing. Abraham knew that an angel from the Lord was going to go before him, and it was all going to work out. God was going to see to it that his servant would be able to find a wife for Isaac. Now, as I said, Abraham had every confidence in the world that God would lead his servant to the right woman, but he also knew that his servant didn't have the same faith that he did. And because of that, he knew that Eliezer would probably refuse to swear to do those three things. You see, part of the custom was if someone made you swear and he said, put your hand under my thighs getting ready to die, and he wants you to take an oath, you did not have to take the oath if you thought it was impossible. Why? Why did the law say that? Why did it dictate that part of the custom? Because remember, what you were saying when you took that type of oath is that if you don't fulfill your duties, my seed will avenge me. They will punish you in some way, but the majority of the time it meant they will kill you. And so you were not required, if you thought the oath was impossible, to swear to that. So Abraham understands, even though he has all the confidence in the world, he knows the angel of the Lord's going to go before him. He's going to be able to find the right woman. God wouldn't have brought him this far. God wouldn't have made these promises. God's going to do this supernatural thing if you just go. But he also knew the servant would probably refuse because he didn't have the same faith. And because of that, he gave his servant an escape clause. Look at verse number 8. If she is unwilling to come back with you, then you're free from this oath of mine. But under no circumstances are you to take my son there. Now, why does he say that? Well, he's given this escape clause because he's already said, what if she won't travel that far from home? And he understood something. If I don't make this very clear to him, when he gets to where he's going, he might say, well, maybe Isaac will come if you're not willing to go. He wanted his servant to know, don't you even hint to that. So I'm going to give you the escape clause so you'll be willing to make this oath. But then he goes further. He says, but under no circumstances are you to take my son back there. In other words, if you go there and God leads you to the right woman, but she refuses to come back with you, you're free from what you swore to do. But you are not free from what you've sworn, that you will not take him back under any circumstances to the land where I came from. And the reason he made him promise that was because he was old and he was stricken in age, and he thought that there was a good possibility that he might die before the servant returned or even the servant left. So just in case that happened, he wanted to make sure that his servant knew exactly what to do in his absence. Now, because of the escape clause, Abraham's servant agreed to take the oath. Look at verse number 9. So the servant took an oath by putting his hand into the thigh of his master Abraham. He swore to follow Abraham's instructions. Now, we're through a little bit early, and the reason we're through a little bit early is because I needed to stop here because we start a new section next time. And the new section is what the servant was looking for in a mate. What was he looking for? Now, we know in the New Testament what we're looking for in a mate. They must be a Christian, and they must exhibit the fruit of the Spirit. Right? Well, they didn't have the Bible like we had back then. So the servant was going to look for certain things to know who the right woman was. We're going to look at that next week, but if we started that tonight, we would get to a point where we weren't through. So we need to stop here.